Hi everyone, and welcome to another of our interviews on selected themes that Radim Passer himself has agreed to give. And if you watch the show, you probably know who Radim Passer is. And if you don't know, check out our last episode, Cars and 417 kilometers per hour, where we have a chat. It's on the same channel. Now, I know it's YouTube, which I didn't know how to say last time. And you can learn all about cars. But anyone who knows Radim a little knows that his greatest worldly passion is not actually cars at all. It's soccer. That's what we will be talking about today. The seed for this idea was sown at the Bruno Mluvka interviews, where Radim introduced our hosted Antonín Panenka. I noticed what amazing details he was adding. That's when I realized that he has these secret talents, such as his amazing memory, that we could use, and it would be a shame not to ask someone who is so soccer mad questions about that sort of things. My colleagues and friends often ask about, too. So today we're discussing all things soccer. We'll talk about history, the present, lots about soccer and our personal relationship with our view of soccer. So sit back and enjoy, because I've done my homework and I know what we'll be touching on. It was a lot of prep for me, and it's great to talk to someone who enjoys it. Radim, welcome and thanks for coming.
Hi.
We're on first-name terms because we're also brothers in Christ, but we'll get to that. My first question isn't hard, because it's an obvious one when someone's a soccer fan. Why are they a fan? What kind of soccer do they like? These are logical questions to ask when you hear how vividly they can talk about matches.
It was in the first grade of elementary school I discovered I enjoyed soccer and that I might have some talent and aptitude for it. Before then, I'd already seen some of a game from the 1970 World Cup in Mexico, which I'll mention later, and I kind of picked up from my dad that the most beautiful soccer was played by South American teams, especially Brazil, but also Argentina and others. Uruguay too, of course, which we'll talk about. All of which meant that basically, since I was a kid, I had a particular affinity for the most beautiful technical soccer, the kind that pleases the eye. When you want to see that extraordinary skill of the best, that was the soccer I always loved as a child. And it's stuck with me to this day.
This question hasn't been rehearsed, but I'll ask it anyway. You played soccer yourself. Were you drawn to technical soccer? Did that experience make you a technical player?
Sure. Although I basically spent my entire youth career as a kid version of Beckenbauer in defence, I played libero, sweeper. But even in defence, I enjoyed playing technical soccer.
Nice. Radim, if I may be so bold, we'll digress a bit here because I know what awaits us, and it would be a real pity not to use your memory. Can you walk us through the history of big league soccer? What was it like? How did it all start? Because some things aren't documented on film, they're just in books. As I also found out from you, only a book can tell you about the best goal. When did big league soccer start and why?
We don't have to go all the way back to the earliest days of soccer in various centuries and different cities around Europe, but perhaps we could start with the beginning of the 20th century. Of course, the principal event in soccer is the World Cup, an event that takes place once every 4 years. But before the first World Cup, there was the history leading up to it. Soccer is obviously a phenomenon, and these days, I'd say billions of people around the world watch it in some shape or form. I think even soccer could be seen as a gift from God that can bring great joy to people around the world. I guess going back to the interwar years, in the 1920s, the first World Cup was essentially preceded by matches at the Olympics. I would single out two of them, the 1924 and 1928 Olympics in Paris and Amsterdam, where Europe first noticed the incredible agility and technicality of the South American teams. especially Uruguay. Uruguay won both these Olympics, which we could say were essentially World Cups. In 24, they beat the Swiss, and in 28, in Amsterdam, they defeated Argentina. The crowds were captivated by the play of those Uruguayans. They were extremely talented players, both technically and in other ways. I would especially mention José Andrade, who was the best soccer player in the world at the time. It was getting to the point where the first World Cup was on the cards, so to speak. So the issue came up, but no European country was willing to take it on because they were afraid of the economic risk. So eventually Uruguay stepped up and said they would be willing to host it. That's how Uruguay came to be named the hosts of the first World Cup in 1930, on the 100th anniversary of that small country's independence. The Uruguayans made good on their promise to build a stadium for 100,000 spectators, the Centenario in Montevideo. When you think about it, the three main South American countries, Brazil, Argentina and Uruguay, are the most soccer-loving nations. Today, Brazil has a population of some 215 million, Argentina just short of 50, and then there's Uruguay, which has 3.5 million. So this tiny country has a small population and has given so much to the world of soccer by making the World Cup in Uruguay a success. The soccer world owes a lot to Uruguay because it gave other countries and nations the encouragement and willingness to host the World Cup as well. But going back to Uruguay in 1930, only 13 teams took part instead of the planned 16. They couldn't muster that many teams, so there was one 4-team group and 3 groups of 3. The winners advanced to the semi-finals. Then came the final between Argentina and Uruguay. The Argentines were playing their 5th game, the Uruguayans their 4th. This essentially confirmed what we'd seen 2 years earlier in Amsterdam, that these were the 2 best teams in the world at the time. Of course, the final was probably the best game. Uruguay beat Argentina 4-2 to win the inaugural World Cup. But don't forget the semi-final matches, Uruguay versus Yugoslavia and Argentina against the United States. Both ended 6-1. Even so, in the group stage, Yugoslavia played very well. All this created a wonderful atmosphere. A number of steamers sailed from Argentina for the final across the bay that separates Buenos Aires from Montevideo. The Uruguayans were very wise because they knew what the crowds of fans were capable of, and they didn't want to let any Argentine guns into Uruguay. They even arranged things so that on the day of the final of that World Cup, they let spectators into the stadium before noon, knowing that they would tire themselves out in the heat. By the time of the game, everyone was relatively calm. So it was definitely a successful championship, even turning a profit economically. As I said, the best player was José Andrade, a unique midfielder, incredibly technical, who didn't score many goals, but was brilliant at creating play. Surprisingly, another of the Uruguayans' outstanding players was a defender called Nassazi. Nassazi was extremely quick, agile, with a soccer brain, and he was even a great shot taker. He was considered the number 2 player at the tournament. The 3rd best player was Stabile, Guillermo Stabile, the top scorer in the championships. He was an Argentinian and scored 8 goals. The first World Cup turned out to be a success, and the whole world was looking forward to the next one.
I'm going to digress a bit because I have something in my notes here. You told me a fascinating story about a Czech player from before, then who, in brogues or whatever you said, was able to kick the ball from halfway line straight into the net. Can you mention that before we get into the World Cup?
That's definitely a good point, because I think that the Czechs undeniably contributed, especially in the pre-war period, to the evolution of some great soccer. And there were some great names. One that maybe many of today's soccer fans don't know is Jan Kosek, who played for Slavia from 1903 and died aged 43 in 1927. He was undeniably talented, not in the sense that he was technically polished, but he was incredibly fast, a fantastic dribbler and an amazing shot. If the reports of the time are to be believed, when he shot at the goalie would catch the ball, but its force would propel him across the goal line. There are a couple of things I wanted to mention. A professional team from Southampton, England, came over to Prague for a friendly against Slavia. They lost 4-0 with Kosek scoring 3 goals for Slavia. Then in 1925, when he was in his 40s and long retired, a Czech team went to play a match in Stockholm, and Kosek was asked to do the ceremonial kick-offs. So he makes his way to the centre circle in a suit and loafers, does some keepy-uppies, and then volleys the ball at the goal. It flies through the air and makes the whole net bulge. Obviously, if a gentleman in a suit could do that, the crowd were excited to see what the soccer players were capable of, but nobody could replicate what Kosek had done before the kickoff.
Yeah, those are great moments. I know you said that initially Slavia had an A team, B team, and C team, and these were actually the best teams. But I don't want to dwell on that. Again, I'm going a little off topic. I hope you don't mind. You said all of Europe was mesmerized by those South American countries. How come they played like that? Was it just in their nature?
Maybe. They might be playful when they're doing something or when they're working. I think the South Americans have that in them to this day, particularly those 3 nations. But I guess the same can be said of the other South American teams. South America basically has 10 soccer nations, and whenever any of them gets to the World Cup, their opponents have to consider them a real threat.
I see, thanks. Returning to what the World Cup is, I'd like to ask, from your perspective, and with your great memory, as we mentioned, about how fascinating it is how you read about some goals, because they're not recorded on video, about how teams progress, world's best players, the top players, the best games. Could you walk us through it a bit? With that happiness you have?
Uruguay was followed by Italy. Of course, this was in the 1930s. Europe was in the grip of this emerging fascist dictatorship in both Italy and obviously Germany. The next World Cup was held in Italy in 1934 and was undoubtedly another success. It used a different system, again 16 teams, but from the beginning a knockout system was used. You had the round of 16, the quarters, the semis and the final. If you lost the game, you went home. Italy won and they clearly had a great team, but it took them a replay to get past Spain. I think that was in the quarterfinals. So in the semi-finals there were the Italians, the Germans, the Austrians and us, Czechoslovakia, which had an exceptionally good team. In the semi against Germany, Oldřich Nejedlý scored a hat-trick and was the tournament's top scorer on 5. The final was us against the Italians. We were great. We played awesome soccer and were the best team. But the Swedish referee, Eklund, I think his name was officiating from the start in a way that would hand Italy the win. Mussolini himself blessed him just before this match kicked off. Antonín Puč put Czechoslovakia in front, but the Italians managed to turn the game around, and I think they won 2-1 in extra time. Interestingly, 3 of Italy's top players were naturalised Argentinians. There was Monti, the outstanding Argentine midfielder who had played in the previous World Cup final against Uruguay. Here again, he was the architect of Italy's success. And in attack, there were two great Argentine wingers. Guiata on the right and Orsi on the left, with Meazza and Ferrari in the middle. Of course, these were legends of pre-war soccer, so the Italians won. But not on merit, because Czechoslovakia deserved to win the cup.
I have a note here.
Nejedly was the best player. I mean, he was the top scorer. But I don't think there was anybody at the championships who was head and shoulders above the others. So I guess there's no need to talk about the tournament's best players.
Then we come to France in '38. Let me ask, were European events making their mark and influencing results by then?
Well, Austria was gone by France 1938, as it had been annexed by Germany. Until now, Brazil may not have missed a World Cup, but they hadn't done well in Uruguay or Italy. This was the first time they had a fantastic team, when the best soccer player in the world back then, Leonidas and Uruguay's Andrade, were probably the world's best pre-war soccer players. The Brazilians' match against the Poles, which ended 6-5, was a magnificent spectacle. The fans loved it. Leonidas played brilliantly. They beat Czechoslovakia in the quarter-finals, but only after a replay, because we drew our first match with them. Then, in the semi-finals, the Brazilians were no match for the Italians. The Italians, it must be said, are one of only two teams ever to have defended their title as world champions. So this was the first time it happened, in 1938. They defeated Brazil. You could say they won the entire tournament deservedly, but in their semi-final against Brazil, Leonidas was out-injured. So we can only speculate how the semi-final might have turned out if he had been fit to play. The tournament's top scorers were Leonidas on 7 and a Hungarian, Zellinger, I think his name was. They both scored 7 goals. Leonidas was definitely the best player at this World Cup. But the Italians also had a great team. I'd single out Meazza, Piola and Ferrari, the 3 forwards, who made a crucial contribution to Italy's victory. In the final, they beat the Hungarians 4-2. The championship definitely deserves to be remembered.
And the next World Cup was in Brazil. Did Brazil manage to break their curse, or perhaps I should say bad luck, from France? How did things work out for Brazil?
Obviously, first and foremost, the world was still recovering from the war, so there had been no World Cup in 42 or 46, which brings us to Brazil in 1950. The Brazilians looked at what happened in Uruguay in 1930 and were a little worried that all those teams might be reluctant to come to South America. Of course, travel was a lot different back then. And they were right to worry because, in the end, only 13 teams showed up again. There were 2 groups of 4, 1 group of 3, and 1 group of 2. Brazil had a truly formidable team this time. I'll get to that. They promised to build the Maracanã Stadium with a capacity of 200,000, the biggest venue in the world a soccer fan could ever visit, because no bigger stadium has been built since. Back then, there were standing terraces. That is no longer the case today.
So it's the largest ever.
Sure, the Maracanã has been converted into an all-seater stadium now, so I guess today it can't even hold 100,000 spectators. But back then it was a stadium for 200,000, and the Brazilians had a legendary team. They had those four forwards, Zizinho, Ademeyer and Jaya, plus Baltazar, who sadly was injured, though he was probably considered the best of the bunch. They really were wizards on the ball. At this championship, again, only the group winners advanced to a final group of 4 teams. Brazil made it through, as did Uruguay, which had the advantage of being in the only 2-team group. So they beat Bolivia 8-0 and went straight into a medal game. The other teams were Spain and Sweden. Interestingly, this was the first time England took part in the World Cup. And they got knocked out. The English tended to poke fun at the Americans back then. But they lost 1-0 to them at this World Cup, which was one of those exciting moments that makes soccer so enjoyable. We may not be happy about it in the moment, but soccer is a game where, through certain coincidences, a pinch of luck and various other influences, even a supposed underdog can beat a stronger team. We've seen that in other tournaments since then. So, in that final group, the Brazilians played dream soccer. They beat the Swedes 7-1, then Spain 6-1. Uruguayans drew 1 and 1-1. So going into the last game, it was clear that Brazil only needed to draw with Uruguay to be crowned champions. In the Spain game, there was a situation I've never seen in my life. I've only read about it. Zizinho dribbled around 3 Spanish defenders, then took the ball round the goalkeeper, waited for him to get up off the ground, did another feint, and dribbled the ball over the goal line. And the 170,000 strong crowd at the Maracana Stadium literally went wild. It was a tournament packed with wonderful action and goals. And then we get to the final, where all anyone in Brazil was talking about was how many goals they were going to score against Uruguay. Only a few cautionary voices were saying that Uruguay knew them too well and might surprise them. And of course, the Uruguayans also had great players. Brazil didn't let them get a whiff of the ball. They just couldn't find the back of the net, though. It took an hour for them to break through the defence. So they made it 1-0, but then they seemed to have feet of clay. And as sometimes happens, people become overly confident, and that can trip them up. That's precisely what happened. The Uruguayans scored twice to turn the game around, and all those ready-made headlines gave way to one big funeral. In fact, about 4 people died in the Maracana Stadium because they simply couldn't handle Brazil's defeat. So that was the 1950 World Cup, perhaps one of the ultimate tragedies. Even little Pelé, who was 10 years old at the time, or not quite 10, and his family had the sore experience of expecting Brazil to win hands down, only to take silver at the World Cup. This brought Uruguay level with Italy at 2 World Cup titles each.
How do you study this stuff? Do you read up on it? Or are these things you've observed over the years? Or do you just sit down and learn for fun?
These are things that I remember from when I was a kid. My soccer Bible back then was a book called The Golden Book of Soccer. It explained what led up to the start of the World Cup and described the individual tournaments and their highlights. Because I've always liked soccer, that information has stuck in my head to this day. Obviously, in preparing for a talk like this, I have to refresh my memory a little. On the other hand, the vast majority of the things we're talking about, you kind of remember your whole life.
I have another World Cup noted here. I confess that I have to read everything from my notes. This time, Switzerland. There, as I understand it, Germany won in the end. Is that right? And what intrigued me when we were chatting was that one team was playing with only 10 players, and I asked you why that was. Can you walk us through the Swiss World Cup too?
This was a world championship, much like the one in Uruguay and later in Sweden, and maybe just now in Qatar, that was hosted by a relatively small country with a small population. Importantly, it was the first post-war World Cup in Europe. There were 16 teams, 4 groups, with the best 2 from each advancing to the quarter-finals. That tournament was exceptional in many ways. For one thing, it was the most free-scoring World Cup in history, taken as the average goals per game. That was 5.38, which is pretty much double what we've seen in, say, the last 10 World Cups. It was a tournament that featured arguably the best European team in the history of soccer. This was Hungary, which had a whole lineup of stars. The Hungarians walked their way through to the final. In the group stage, they beat the Germans 8-3. There were some wild scores. I think they won their second game 9-0. Teams only played 2 matches in the groups if there was no need for the third. The best matches in the championship, and there were several of them, coincidentally all ended 4-2. In the quarter-finals there were Uruguay versus England, which Uruguay won 4-2, then Hungary versus Brazil, where Hungary won 4-2, and in the semi-finals, Hungary played Uruguay. This was the best match of the whole tournament, with the Hungarians running out 4-2 winners. That took them to a final against Germany. Perhaps the best soccer player in Europe at the time, Puskás, played the first and maybe the second game where he got injured. This sidelined him until the final against the Germans. Playing him was a bit of a risk because he had not fully recovered. He scored anyway. The Hungarians were 2-0 up after 10 minutes, and it all looked like it was going to be a repeat of the group game, which Hungary won 8-3. But then Puskás' injury flared up, and you couldn't substitute in soccer back then. So the Hungarians were down to 10 men. They still dominated, but missed 13 chances. In the end, the Germans' doggedness turned the game around and they won 3-2. So the best team was definitely Hungary, but the world title went to the Germans. The top scorer was Kosek with 11 goals, an amazing feat. When you consider he did that in just 5 games. Puskás was probably the tournament's best player, even though he had to miss half the matches. So that was the World Cup in Switzerland, where you saw scores like Austria's 7-5 triumph over the hosts Switzerland in the quarter-finals. So these were the sort of results in what was then the most prolific goal-scoring World Cup.
If they couldn't have substitutes in the game, does that mean that they had to keep to the same 11 guys the whole World Cup, or just each game?
Each game.
So just no substitutions during the game. Got it. Now we're entering the Pelé area, which I've noted with a long line of 458 in Sweden. So perhaps you could discuss the 17-year-old Pelé here.
Pelé was only 17 years old, but the Brazilian coach decided to take him to this World Cup. And I'd say this was a tremendous decision for all of soccer history. Pelé didn't play the first few games. Of course, at this tournament, qualifiers were being played. Again, there were 16 teams in 4 groups. 2 from each advanced to the quarter-finals. Brazil played the first 2 games without Pelé. After all, it had an abundance of other stars. Pelé got his chance in the third group match, which ended 0-0. That was the only game in which Brazil failed to score and in which they drew. Otherwise, they won all their matches in that tournament. Brazil deserved to win, no question. They were easily the best team of that World Cup. Before the tournament, Pelé found out that he'd been registered in Europe as Edson Arantes, not under his full name of Edson Arantes do Nascimento. So he said he'd teach Europe to remember his full name, and I think he did. The Brazilians beat Wales 1-0 in the quarter-finals. Thanks to Pelé's goal, Wales defended well, so it wasn't an easy game for the Brazilians. Then, in the semi-finals, in the best game of the whole tournament, they beat the best European team there, which was France. Brazil won 5-2. It was a great match. Brazil went on to defeat Sweden by the same 5-2 score in the final. For France, I'd have to mention Radim Passer, who was their best player at the time. He played for Real Madrid, and I think he was named Europe's top scorer player for that year. And then there was Just Fontaine, who was a fantastic goal scorer, netting 13 goals in 6 games. That's still the record in terms of the most goals scored by one player at a World Cup, and I think it will be hard to ever beat. There were still about 4 goals being scored per game, so it was hugely exciting to watch. And the Brazilians had a great team, especially their forward line of Garrincha, Didi, Pelé, Vava and Zagallo, who started in those crucial games. They were also in the team 4 years later in Chile. This was perhaps the best national team offence the world has ever seen. Pelé and Didi, extraordinarily gifted soccer players, were the 2 best individuals at this tournament. As we mentioned a moment ago, this is where the Pelé era began.
Thanks for that explanation. I see here that in '62 in Chile, it must have been bitter in a way for the Czechoslovaks to come up against a winning machine like Pelé in Brazil in the final. When you look back over the years of following soccer, I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. Did you ever feel like you would have wanted Czechoslovakia to win? Or were you firmly in the South American camp? It just occurred to me now. That's why I'm asking. I mean, in the 1962 tournament.
I've never rooted for the Czech national team either. I mean, of course, I cheer for our team, but not against Brazil or Argentina, and quite possibly not even against Uruguay, assuming that is that Brazil or Argentina or Uruguay are playing some nice soccer. If that wasn't the case, I'd be rooting for our guys.
Is there anything else that stands out to you from Chile, apart from the fact that Brazil defended its title? Because that's something of a rarity.
The tournament in Chile was the 3rd on South American soil. Brazil became the only team, other than Italy, to win the World Cup twice in succession. In the group stage, Pelé played the first game against Mexico, scoring a beautiful goal to give Brazil a 2-0 win. And then they played Czechoslovakia. That's when Pelé got hurt and pulled his hamstring. After that, he was basically just hobbling on the wing because he couldn't run properly. That match ended 0-0. Another strong team in that group was Spain, but it was Brazil and Czechoslovakia who progressed to the next round. The Brazilians had to accept Pelé would be out for the rest of the tournament. Even with Pelé gone, they beat Spain. In the quarter-finals, they played England, which was perhaps one of the highlights of that tournament. The English coach assumed that without Pelé, Brazil would be a shadow of that famous team. After the game, he conceded that, even without Pelé, they were the best team in the world. Brazil won 3-1, then defeated Chile 4-2 in the semi-final, and Czechoslovakia 3-1 in the final. I think from Czechoslovakia's point of view, this was a huge success, and I'd say it was no disgrace to lose to Brazil in the final. I would also point out that, following in Pelé's footsteps, Garrincha assumed the mantle of the best player of the tournament here. He was probably the best right winger of all time, a brilliant dribbler, and he scored 2 goals apiece against England in the quarters and Chile in the semis. This tournament didn't have a standout goal scorer. I think there were about 6 players who scored 4 goals. Garrincha was easily the best player of the tournament, and I think this was a time of score euphoria for Brazil.
Sorry to digress again. I'm reading ahead about 1966. And this was the first time in a long while that a team won the World Cup on its home turf. This was England, which before that said that those other teams are admirable. Again, I think it's a very sporting thing to be able to respect and congratulate the winner. So what about 1966? How come England managed to decide for everyone's game plan? Was there the spirit that we're playing at home? We're more motivated or something else?
We have 22 World Cups behind us, and in the first half of those, it was more common for the host team to pull off victory. We're talking Uruguay in 1930, Italy in 34, then England 66 and Germany in 74, but since then only France in 98. In other words, of course, there must be some extra motivation. But I would also say that there have often been cases where the hosts were thought to have a good chance of winning, but couldn't take the pressure and see things through to the end. The English did manage to pull this off in 66. We can certainly say that they deserved their win. There were two other teams that I think were their equals. One was Germany, their opponent in the final, and the other was Portugal, who finished third. Looking at the South Americans, Argentina is interesting. They went out in the quarterfinals against England, and there was the big debate because the Argentines felt quite aggrieved. I'm mentioning this because 3 of Argentina's players were named in the tournament's best 11, even though they were knocked out in the quarterfinal. This tells us something about the quality of that team. That was Beckenbauer's first World Cup. He didn't play libero yet, he was in midfield and did really well, even scoring many important goals. The top scorer at the tournament was Eusebio. His nickname was the Black Panther from Portugal. He managed to score 9 goals in that World Cup, and perhaps the only better player than him was the great English midfielder, Bobby Charlton, one of the best ever European soccer players. I would also mention that Brazil suffered because of their technical play. In the group stage, they were kicked around by the Bulgarians and then by the Portuguese. The Bulgarians injured Pelé, so he didn't play in the second game against Hungary. And in the third game, he was again roughed up by the Portuguese. The tournament progressed. One of the interesting results was when North Korea beat Italy 1-0 in the group stage. The Italians, hugely frustrated, went home. In the quarterfinals, North Korea were 3-0 up against Portugal. But then Eusebio came into his own, scoring 4 goals. The Portuguese won 5-3. Probably the best games of the tournament were Portugal versus Hungary, said to be a great match, in the group stage, and then England against Portugal in the semi-final. So it was a World Cup where the South American teams were taught that sometimes European toughness, even roughness, can reach such a point that it makes it impossible for them to play their technical, attractive soccer. I think it would have been a shame for soccer for that trend to continue.
In 1970, we find ourselves in Mexico, crossing the pond for a change. Here, it is a South American national team that takes charge again. I'm interested in what you said about the European stubbornness, hardness, perhaps even roughness coming to the fore in '66. Do you suspect that this led to any changes in the rules or refereeing? Or did South American teams have to adapt?
I don't think so. In Mexico, the game was played at high altitude, which actually meant each of the teams needed time to acclimatise. So a lot of them arrived well in advance. I think the best national team up to then, in how they played, was Brazil. Look at them in Sweden in 58 and Chile in 62. But the Brazil of 1970, that was probably the best national team this world has ever seen. That was soccer others could only dream of. They absolutely deserved to win the World Cup. It's worth noting that Uruguay back in 1930 also won all their tournament matches in normal time. But that was only 4 matches. And here the Brazilians played 6, winning all of them, with 19 goals for and 7 against, so on average they were winning by 2 goals a match. One of the best games in terms of quality in the whole tournament was perhaps in the group stage between Brazil and England. Brazil won 1-0. Incidentally, that was the first soccer match I ever watched on TV, because I was not quite 7 years old. It was the first time I took in names like Pelé and Jairzinho, the main Brazilian stars, although there were many others. Rivelino, Gerson, Tostao. They were the best players in their positions. And of course, the defence was also great. And in fact, there were some immensely interesting matches. In the quarter-final, England were leading Germany 2-0 and looked set to win, but the coach took off, Bobby Charlton, with about 20 minutes left. The Germans mounted a comeback, won 3-2, and advanced to the semi-finals against the Italians. The Italians usually win when they face Germany, and that's exactly what happened this time. After a tough fight, the Italians beat the Germans 4-3 in extra time and progressed to the final against Brazil, which Brazil dominated, winning 4-1. That was simply a fantastic team. Germany's Gerd Müller was the tournament's top scorer with 10 goals, which again is a remarkable number. No one has scored that many goals or even come close since.
I have a note on that here.
The second best scorer who actually scored in all his games was the Brazilian Jairzinho. He scored 7 goals. And of course the best player, and he was named the best sportsman in the whole world that year, was Pelé. For him, this was his 3rd World Cup triumph. Nobody had ever done that. And I guess, in soccer terms, that made Pelé immortal, because I don't think anybody will ever forget him.
That brings down the curtain on the Pelé era, and we head back to Europe, to Germany in 1974. And surprisingly, Germany won. You've mentioned that not many teams have won the World Cup on their own turf. That was a close 2-1 victory over Holland. Was the soccer in that final good to watch, or have there been better ones?
It was the first World Cup that I really followed as a kid, and I watched all the games that there were to see. I have to say, I was disappointed with Brazil. Pelé was not even 34 years old, but he decided not to take part. And that Brazil team was not what the crowds had expected. Uruguay, they weren't strong at all, and Argentina had only a few moments of brilliance. So Brazil eventually got into the 3rd place playoff, but the event was clearly dominated by 2 European teams. The best in the tournament were the Dutch with their offensive soccer and the best player in the world at the time, Johan Cruyff. The Germans were 2nd best, but in the final it was topsy-turvy. The Dutch clearly had the better of the game for the vast majority of the match, but the Germans defended their half-time lead of 2-1 and claimed the World Cup for the 2nd time. The top scorer, however, was a Pole, Lato. This was the first time Poland made its mark in soccer. It had some very good players and beat Brazil 1-0 in the 3rd place playoff.
I have a note here that it was a relatively weak tournament.
Apart from the Dutch and occasionally the Germans, you had shown glimpses of good soccer. The quality wasn't enough to really make you excited, but the Dutch played some excellent soccer.
That changed in '78. Did soccer come back to where it should be?
In 78, Johan Cruyff was still in his prime, but he didn't want to go to Argentina. At this tournament, Argentina and Brazil had much better teams than at the previous World Cup, and Peru was playing some decent soccer. There were 4 groups again of 4 again, with 2 teams from each advancing to a further 2 groups of 4. The winners of each group progressed to the final, and the second place finishers played for 3rd place. Brazil was in the same group as Argentina. It was because of one score that Argentina made it to the final. It was that memorable 6-0 win over Peru, which many people criticised. The Brazilians deservedly beat the Italians 2-1 for 3rd, and the final was between Argentina and the Netherlands. Argentina was definitely the better team, but the Dutch equalised and it went to extra time. Argentina won 3-1 in extra time. The tournament's best player and top scorer was Mario Kempes, who, at the time, I think, was one of the few Argentine players playing in Europe. This was his World Cup. He was the star of the show and also the main architect of that Argentine victory.
Because of the time and your workload, I'm going to push you now to 82. I'm actually really looking forward to 90, and you don't know why, but I'll tell you then. Because a question occurred to me that I really like. So, another little digression, but let's move on to Spain in 82. What caught my eye here was the 6 goals by Rossi, because you know I'm a motorcycle fan, so I have a different association with that name. But what game was this? I see quite few comments here about a 10-1 match with Hungary. That almost sounds like a celebration. How did Spain go, and what would you highlight from it?
The whole soccer world was looking forward to that tournament. Brazil had an unbelievable reputation going into it. They had a dream team. On their European tour of England, France and Germany, they'd won all 3 games. Perhaps their best striker at the time, Careca, was injured just before the tournament. But, even so, the 1982 Brazil team was quite possibly the second best national team of all time, after the 1970 team. They played dream soccer. It was a joy to watch those games. One goal more beautiful than the other. Trailing 1-0 to the Soviet Union, they came back to win 2-1. They were losing 1-0 against Scotland, but won 4-1. And that's how they continued in the second round group. For the first time, there were 24 teams, 6 groups of 4, with the top 2 advancing to a round where there were 4 groups of 3. The winner then proceeded to the semi-finals. The group of death was Brazil, Argentina, Italy. The Brazilians beat Diego Maradona's Argentina 3-1. Quite conclusively, then it happened, one of those matches that makes soccer the beautiful game. Because sometimes the underdog wins. Incredibly, the Italians, who had underperformed at this World Cup until then, managed to beat Brazil 3-2. The soccer commentators at the time said that if these two played 10 games together, Brazil would win all of them. But this was the 11th one where everything went wrong for Brazil. And the Italians won 3-2. I have to say, having beaten Brazil, they deservedly won the rest of the tournament, defeating Poland in the semi-final and Germany in the final. Paolo Rossi, I'm sorry, it wasn't Valentino, was the tournament's top scorer. Whether he was the best player is debatable because the Brazilians, even though they didn't make it, even to the semi-finals, had 5 players in all-star team. They had great defenders in Leandro and Junior, then Falcao and Socrates and Zico and Eder in attack. They were the best players in their positions at the time. I think that when this Brazil team lost to Italy, it was one of the worst days of my life, as far as sport's concerned. I felt this huge sadness that I was unable to do anything about it. I would say it's one of the greatest soccer and sporting tragedies that has ever happened. The fact that this awesome team dropped out so early at this tournament, I thought it was a good World Cup otherwise.
Let's jump to Mexico 86, if we can, because I'm holding on to this thought. I have a question for you that we haven't prepared. It's interesting. When I look at the whole of this page, I see everywhere that the best players always scored 6 goals. That goes all the way up to 98. That just seems an interesting thought. Sorry.
What you're saying, this idea, essentially, Gerd Müller in Mexico, 1970, he was the last double-digit scorer. Lato scored 7 in 74, and then until 2002, none of the top scorers netted more than 6. So in 1986 in Mexico, Gary Lineker, an Englishman, was the top scorer at the tournament. 24 teams again, but this time the setup was different. The top 2 in each group advanced directly, and then the 4 best third-place finishers in terms of points, or, failing that, goal difference, advanced to the round of 16. We should mention here that this was Diego Maradona's tournament. While I consider Pelé to be the best soccer player of the 20th century, unequivocally, and I would say unequivocally, Lionel Messi is the best player of the 21st century. Diego Maradona's individual performance as one player at one World Cup has yet to be surpassed. If you look at what Maradona did in Mexico in '86, he caressed in this incredible way the soul of soccer fans who love the most beautiful soccer at its finest. Argentina deserved their win. They were definitely the best team there. The second best team was Brazil, who were extremely unlucky to lose to France in the quarter-final, which went to a penalty shootout, in which Brazil came up short. The French then dominated the semi-final against the Germans, but Germany scored 2 goals from 2 counter-attacks, leaving France to play for bronze again. So it was Germany versus Argentina in the final, with Argentina winning 3-2. This was a very good, interesting match, which the Argentines made unnecessarily hard for themselves because they had an easy 2-0 lead. But then the Germans, as is their custom, knocked the ball into the net twice, from 2 set plays to make it 2-2. In the end, Argentina triumphed 3-2 after a winner by Burruchaga, beautifully assisted by Diego Maradona. So this was a tournament that I think those who saw will never forget. A lot of wonderful games with Maradona's performances towering above everything else.
You beautifully played into the question I have here about there being games that those who saw them will never forget.
I have to single one out in particular, the match between Argentina and England, which was highlighted by 2 goals that will always stay in the memory. One was Maradona's hand, an Argentinian revenge for the Falklands, or whatever you want to call it. But of course, it wasn't sportsmanlike. And then a few minutes later, he scored the most fantastic goal ever scored at a World Cup, taking the ball from deep in his own half, rounding 5 English players, then rounding the goalkeeper and slotting into an empty net. I think since then only Lionel Messi and nobody else has done anything remotely like that.
Now we're coming to 1990, exactly 1 year after our country's milestone year of '89. The question comes to mind. I assume that before '89, you probably didn't have a chance to go to the World Cup. But did you go to any tournaments after that?
I've only been to 1 game. I should perhaps point that out, but definitely not in 1990. I was looking forward to seeing Brazil and Argentina again. The Brazilians weren't as strong as in the 2 previous tournaments. The squad had changed quite a bit after all. Even so, they were unlucky to crash out in the round of 16 against Argentina. Diego Maradona, with his only successful, wonderful solo effort, played a pass to Canigia, who took the ball around the Brazilian goalkeeper and scored. But the South American teams were generally a disappointment, with perhaps the one notable exception of Colombia. Argentina didn't play any outstanding soccer here. I'm sure this was partly due to the fact that Diego Maradona was playing with a niggling injury, so that obviously affected his game. Despite that, as I say, he was still named the tournament's second best player. Here, I would say the best soccer was played by Italy. You rarely hear that said about Italian soccer, but here the Italians played some really good soccer. Even in the semi-final against Argentina, they were the better team, but they lost on penalties. That paved the way for the Germans to win. They beat England on penalties in the other semi-final, and in the final they defeated Argentina 1-0 after being given a penalty kick. The Germans certainly had a great team here in Italy, perhaps second best after the Italians themselves. The top scorer was the Italian Salvatore. I think Salvatore's surname was Schillaci. He scored 6 goals, but their best player was Roberto Baggio, who played some fantastic stuff. So South America's best teams were a bit of a disappointment. As for the Europeans, you had Italy and Germany. There were high hopes for the Dutch, but they lost 2-1 to the Germans in the round of 16. The Dutch were the reigning European champions, and they had a great team. But that team didn't produce the same results as some of the other less brilliant Dutch teams in the future.
We then skip to 94 and find ourselves in the United States for the first time. The hosts probably had no aspirations of winning. Was there a reason, or did you register why the 94 tournament was held in America?
Soccer has obviously become a global phenomenon, and I think FIFA were trying and wanting to popularize the game as much as possible on every continent. So it was a perfectly logical and natural choice for the United States to host the tournament. I believe it was extremely successful, the most well attended. It even had the highest average attendance per game. Brazil reclaimed the title after a wait of 24 years. They won this World Cup, and deservedly so. They had the best team and the best player, Romario. The top scorers, if I remember correctly, were the Bulgarian Stoichkov and the Russian Salenko. But Salenko probably only made the leaderboard because he scored 5 in one game. I think that was against Cameroon. Otherwise, I'm not actually sure the Russians even made it beyond the group stage. There were still 24 teams, which means that again 16 made it to the next round. The quarter-final match between Brazil and the Netherlands, which Brazil won 3-2, was perhaps the highlight of the tournament. For a long time in the World Cup final, we were used to seeing each team score at least 1 goal. And there were always at least 3 goals. They didn't change until 1990 in Italy, when Germany defeated Argentina just 1-0 from a penalty. And here in the United States, Brazil and Italy tied 0-0 after extra time, so the World Cup was decided by penalty kicks for the first time. The Brazilians won and became world champions for the 4th time.
I know, because we've discussed it. You've implied that Messi is the best of the best. We're looking at 98 now. And I see in your notes that, in your opinion, Ronaldo was the best player here. So, ultimately, a different player. Can you give us a little bit more insight into that? Because I know there's been this lifelong rivalry between Ronaldo and Messi. And we said that if it wasn't for Messi, Ronaldo's probably the best player. From the 21st century perspective. Is that right?
This is a different Ronaldo.
Oh, I got a little confused by that. That's great.
That's okay.
It's all coming out now.
That's all part of it. He may be overly proud by proclaiming himself the best of all time, but it's worth noting that Cristiano Ronaldo, while he's undeniably a fantastic player, is actually only the second best Ronaldo of all time, because the best Ronaldo of all time is the Brazilian one.
I knew we talked about it.
The first time he was at the World Cup was in the United States when he was 18 years old. He was there because he was the top scorer in the Brazilian league at just 18 years old. What is amazing is that he didn't play in that tournament at all. Then he went to Europe. He made his name first in Holland, where I think he played for PSV Eindhoven, and then he transferred straight to Barcelona, where he became the top scorer in the Spanish league. And by that year, by 1998, of course, he was the best player in the world. I think he was named twice in a row. If he hadn't been injured for so many seasons in his career, I think the world might have even ranked him on a par with Diego Maradona. I don't think there can be any debate about who the three best players of all time are. You have Pelé and Lionel Messi. I can't say who is the better of the two because they are the two best players of all time, with Diego Maradona right behind them. And then I would definitely put the Brazilian Ronaldo in fourth place because of what he could do with the ball, how he could round opponents at tremendous speed. Nobody else has ever done that except the players I just mentioned. So what I want to say is that this could have been his tournament, as the Brazilians played pretty well. They had a couple of wobbles, but all in all, they made it through to the final, where they played France and lost by a resounding 3-0. We can say that France won the tournament deservedly. I don't think they dominated other teams, but it was a deserved triumph. It's worth mentioning that Brazilian Ronaldo was very unfit in the final because he had quite serious medical problems the night before the final match. So we saw just a shadow of the great player he was. The way the game was played didn't match the 3-0 result. France became the last hosts to win the World Cup. I should also mention that Zinedine Zidane and, of course, Ronaldo were the best players at that tournament.
Thank you for the Ronaldo correction. I remember bits and pieces, but you can see I'm just never going to have the knowledge. So I'm not going to talk about Ronaldo anymore. I'm happy with my Rossi. In 2002, what interests me, and I guess it ties in with what you were saying about popularizing soccer around the world, is that the tournament was shared by two countries, one of which was Japan. What also interested me, when we discussed it together, was your insight on Brazil. I'll leave you to explain, but could you tell us how it was organized there? Was it like one part was played in one country and another part in another country, or was it all mixed up?
From France 98 onwards, there were 32 teams. So there were 8 groups of 4 teams, with the first 2 advancing to the knockout round of 16. Some of those groups played in Japan and the others in Korea. It was a very successful World Cup and certainly proved that it was possible to hold the tournament in 2 countries at once, despite the distances between them. It was only the 3rd World Cup where the winner never lost a match. As world champions here, the Brazilians, as had been the case since Germany 1974, had to play 7 games. They won all 7, scoring 18 and conceding 4. So again, on average, they were winning by 2 goals a game. And they had some excellent players. Ronaldo, who had been plagued by injury for several seasons, returned just before the World Cup. He managed to get fit enough to become the top scorer and the best player. Since Miller in Mexico in 1970, no one had scored 8 goals in a World Cup. After Ronaldo, that feat wasn't repeated again until Mbappé in Qatar in 2022. Ronaldo was performing superbly, backed up by Rivaldo, who was essentially the tournament's second best player. Plus, you had Ronaldinho emerging as a big star. So, of course, the Brazilians had a terrific team. In the final, they beat the Germans 2-0, having beat the English 2-1 in the quarter-final. That was an extraordinary match. For the first and so far the last time, the world champions knelt in the centre circle after the game and thanked God for the wonderful experience of winning the World Cup. The humility of those Brazilians was a special experience for me because I can't imagine any of the European teams doing anything like that. And it hasn't happened since then either. On the other hand, for me, because I was such a newly converted Christian at the time, this was a huge experience and it was actually very rewarding to be able to see it at all. The way the Brazilians performed really was a joy, and it made you look forward to what you were going to see at the next World Cup.
Which was 2006 in Germany. I'm smiling because I see here your notes on how the final went. Looking at it, it's really uncommon for it to be won in extra time. I can't even imagine the players nervous in a final. We know that you're a Messi fan, and those of us around you really wished, and I'm telling you this now, we were really hoping Messi would win the last World Cup. We'll get to that. So in some of those games, we were tense and we were wondering how you must be feeling. We'll come to that because I was fascinated on how you would react, how you experienced the penalty shootout and all that. But going back to Germany 2006, is there anything that stands out that you would say is an important message, as it were, from this tournament?
There were definitely great expectations for this World Cup. The Brazilians were the overwhelming favourites. They easily had the strongest attacking formation of all the teams that were there. Their forwards were the main stars at Barcelona, Real Madrid, Inter Milan and AC Milan. So all these players were playing for the very best clubs and they were expected to deliver nothing less than the World Cup. I haven't said yet that I've always wanted to see a Brazil-Argentina World Cup final. It's never happened yet. Perhaps the closest we've come to it was in Mexico in 1986, when, as I said, Brazil were supposed to brush aside France, beat Germany, and face off against Argentina in the final. In this World Cup in Germany, I was again hoping to see it. It was here that I noticed Lionel Messi's huge talent. This was his first time at the World Cup. I already knew a little bit about him from other games. The thing is, the Brazilians have had some tough seasons at their clubs and basically didn't show up and play the game that people were used to and expected of them. This was the only World Cup so far for me where I flew to watch a game. It was a group match in which the Czechoslovaks, or Czechs by then, lost to Italy. Italy were deserved winners, 2-0 winners. They were plainly the better team back then. Brazil ended up losing to France in the quarter-finals. I have to say that the French deserved their 1-0 win. They were simply better in that game. That left Argentina. They were playing the Germans and were 1-0 up. They were actually the better team. But then the coach made a tactical error. They thought they could see out the game against the Germans, so they took off their offensive players and put more defence in. They didn't bring Messi on at all, even though he would have had a much better chance at putting the score beyond doubt. So Argentina lost eventually on penalties and went home. The semi-finals were now an all-European affair, and for me, that's not so attractive. It's not so exciting or interesting anymore. Having said that, I think the Italians played excellently in the semi-final against the Germans, where they won 2-0, and in the final against France. The match itself wasn't great. It ended 1-1. The Italians won their 4th World Cup title in the penalty shootout. Zidane played excellently throughout the World Cup, and the Italians had a great stopper in Cannavaro back then. But otherwise, the World Cup didn't offer anything out of the ordinary, so I was immediately looking forward to the World Cup moving to another continent to see what kind of quality awaited us there.
We're now heading to South Africa. But before we do, let me ask you one more thing, Radim. We might touch on this, but we know you've watched Messi in pretty much every game he's played. This has been since 2010. Would that be right?
Yes. Since the summer of 2011, I really have seen every game he's played. I wanted to watch him. Up to that summer of 2011, I watched all matches that were interesting and important, so of course I had already noticed that Messi was obviously the best player in the world at that time. He came to South Africa in 2010 with that reputation. Surprisingly, he didn't score a single goal in the whole tournament. He hit the post a few times, had some big chances, saw miraculous saves by goalkeepers and made many passes into scoring situations, but luck wasn't on his side. Argentina played some nice soccer. They advanced to the quarter-finals, but came apart against Germany, who won 4-0. The score is misleading, of course, but that's just the way it was. The whole tournament was eventually won by Spain, whose squad was mainly made up of players from Barcelona at that time, the best club in the world. Journalists asked the national coach, Vincent Del Bosque, what the difference was between Spain and Barcelona. He had a quick think and said Lionel Messi. Because, of course, it was Lionel Messi who gave Barcelona that something extra soccer-wise compared to the Spanish national team. But it has to be said the Spanish actually played very nice soccer and their World Cup win was deserved. I think there were definitely some interesting matches. I probably wouldn't single any of them out here. Brazil, unluckily, almost stupidly, lost 2-1 to the Netherlands in the quarter-finals, which basically handed the Dutch the chance to defeat Uruguay and reach the final, where they lost 1-0 to Spain in extra time. Andreas Iniesta probably scored the goal of his life in that extra time against the Dutch, because this was Spain's first appearance in a World Cup final. Iniesta's goal gave them the title. Uruguay made it to the semi-finals for the first time in years, since 1970. They played decent soccer here, so once again this small country with a population of, let's say, 3.5 million achieved major success in soccer.
I'm looking at the notes on 2014 here, Radim. I'm moving us along quite intentionally because it struck me that you've said a few times about teams deserving to win. And here's the notes you say, that Germany absolutely deserved to win the World Cup in Brazil in 2014.
The Germans claimed the World Cup for the 4th time, and I would say it's the first time they really did deserve to win. They had 2 outstanding games, one against the Portuguese in the group stage, I think it was 4-0. Then they beat Brazil 7-1 in the semi-finals, which is probably the biggest disaster in the history of Brazilian soccer. And the goals they were scoring against Brazil weren't your typical German goals, they were Brazilian goals. They completely dismantled that defence. I have to say it was the weakest Brazil I've ever seen in my life at a World Cup. That was a huge disappointment, whereas Argentina, of course, always had a chance because they could match Germany in everything they did. They had at least as many opportunities as the Germans to score, but in the end, the Germans won. Lionel Messi was named the tournament's best player, but Germany taking the team as a whole. It must be added that they can definitely be said to have won the cup on merit. Argentina, we could say, were deservedly second and performed well, but the Brazilians were a disappointment.
And then we go to Russia in 2018, who was hosting for the first time, but I can see why. And this is where France won 4-2 against Croatia. I know that. Even I remember. I recall how emotional it was, and I had a Croatian friend, so he was experiencing as you would expect, because of course they're hot-blooded. So there were no big celebrations after that. Was there anything interesting about this tournament, this World Cup in Russia, or not?
Undoubtedly there was. A lot of people thought it was Lionel Messi's last chance to win the World Cup while he was still in his prime. It's worth adding that Argentina only made it to the finals in a last-gasp match. Again, thanks to Lionel Messi, they had to win against Ecuador at an altitude of 2,800 meters. They were 1-0 down against their hosts in the first minute, but then Lionel Messi took the match by the scruff of the neck and scored a hat-trick. So Argentina made it to the World Cup, but the team was overly reliant on Messi and was waiting to see what he could do. Again, I don't think that the lineup was well structured, especially in attack. I don't see more than 2 of the offensive stars had played together. In other words, Argentina's attack options were weakened. To this day, I don't understand why the coaches pieced the squad together the way they did. I think the fact that they didn't do well against the Croats affected them mentally a bit in the round of 16 against France, which was probably one of the highlights of the tournament. The French won 4-3, and rightly so. Argentina was definitely not the better team. The French were better, and I think they deservedly won the whole World Cup. The Brazilians needlessly lost their quarter-final against Belgium, so they also packed up early to go home. And it was a European affair again from the semi-final onwards, with a well-deserved victory for the French. Now I'm just thinking who the top scorer was at the tournament. The best player, I think, was Luka Modric. For the French, there was Antoine Griezmann, and, of course, Kylian Mbappé was starting to make his presence felt. In many matches, he convinced the soccer world of his strengths, which are absolutely unrivaled.
On the goals front, Harry Kane scored 6.
Yes, Harry Kane.
And then Mbappé.
In Mexico, 86, it was Gary Lineker. Here it was Harry Kane as top scorer.
Let's come to the best of the World Cups, at least from your point of view, because of course there's one question I'm going to have. So, Qatar. Here I see 2 names that I'm interested in. Maybe I'm going to digress a little bit from all the matches, but do you see one of them as being some sort of future successor in the post-Messi era? Messi will still be playing for a while, of course, but when he retires, would you say this player you like to watch?
I guess that remains to be seen. When Messi was starting out, my favourite soccer player was Ronaldinho. And it didn't take me long to realise that Messi's consistently brilliant performances meant that he might even surpass Ronaldinho in my eyes. Qatar was a great tournament. I think it was very attractive for spectators. Everything was close. It all went well, and I imagine the whole soccer world was waiting to see how Leo Messi's final chance would pan out. Their first match against Saudi Arabia, of course, was a travesty, although they started well. But something inside told me it wasn't over yet. They can still do it. If they win the next 6 games, the title is theirs. Argentina really didn't go for it. and went for it with purpose. You could see that this was a team, that it wasn't just Leo Messi anymore, even though Leo Messi again made the difference and was the best player of the whole tournament. The top scorer was Kylian Mbappé. He scored 8 goals. Messi scored 7. But Messi was the one who actually made the difference in the game at crucial moments. I think his goal to make it 1-0 against Mexico was a turning point in Argentina's performance in that tournament because Mexico was an incredibly tough opponent. They defended very well, but for a moment they left Messi free somewhere between 22 and 23 meters from the goal, and in that split second he managed to control the ball perfectly with his first touch, and with his second he sent it into the goal with an unstoppable shot. So I'd say that was a key moment. And then that strength came to the fore. They were really going for the title. And even it looked like they might have had an easier opponent than France in the final. I actually felt like God was saying to me, hey, this is going to be the right final. I watched the final with a kind of calmness. I didn't let my emotions get the better of me because I understood from God that the story would end well, that Leo Messi and Argentina would win the title. My sons and I really enjoyed it in our Argentine jerseys. I have to say that it will remain one of those absolutely unforgettable days in my life.
Radim, thank you for your summary. I think that the end bit was totally on point.
I would add, by the way, that many commentators say that final was the best World Cup final ever. I can't really say I didn't see all of them, but the drama, that would certainly suggest they're right. The way it climaxed, and then when the young Argentine Montiel went up for the decisive penalty in the shootout, for him, that must have been an experience that nothing in his soccer career will ever surpass.
You've played me beautifully there. We've talked about it. And stepping away from the World Cup, how would you evaluate this? I mean, you said that this game was definitely one of the best in terms of spectator excitement. Even I was excited, and I'm saying that as someone who's not really into watching and enjoying soccer, I have to say that I did enjoy the Qatari games, a lot of them. Looking back at soccer matches of the past, is there anyone that really stands out that you'd gladly watch again and again?
As I mentioned, I've been waiting all my life for a Brazil-Argentina World Cup final. That hasn't happened yet. But I did see a match that I took to be a kind of gift from the Lord the day before my wedding. In early June 2012, Brazil and Argentina played a friendly soccer match in New Jersey in the United States. A young Neymar was playing for Brazil, Messi in his prime was playing for Argentina, and it was such a beautiful spectacle. It was the most beautiful international soccer match I have ever seen in my life, with all the drama of the Brazilians leading 1-0. Then, by half-time, Leo Messi had made it 2-1 with 2 exquisite goals. The pendulum swung back and the Brazilians took a 3-2 lead. Argentina equalised, and 5 minutes before the end, Leo Messi took the ball halfway down the pitch and finished with a beautiful shot with the inside of his left foot that curled the ball into the top right corner from the goalkeeper's perspective and proved to be the winning goal. That was an unforgettable match. I've taped it and I like to watch it from time to time because such great internationals are a rarity.
I noticed something said about Barcelona. We were talking about the fact that at a certain point in time, those club players or those clubs became steadily stronger than the national teams, so to speak. What do you think of the changes that suddenly allowed clubs to cast their net a lot wider than players from their own country? Has it made soccer better or worse? What would you say?
It's attractive for spectators because, obviously, there aren't as many international matches as there are at club level, since soccer is a global sporting and commercial phenomenon. This understandably means that the richest clubs in the world can afford the best players and therefore now actually play better soccer than anything the top national teams used to play. I would especially point out the soccer that Barcelona was playing from the Pep Guardiola era, since sometime around 2008, when the club had maybe the best attacking trio of all time in Messi, Suarez, Neymar. So I'd say until 2017, although its greatest successes were achieved up to 2015. Personally, I don't think I'd ever seen that quality of soccer, and I wonder whether anyone will ever be able to replicate that. On the subject of club soccer, I would probably single out three eras. Real Madrid, the second half of the 50s, a legendary club with great players. Puskas, Di Stefano, Raymond Kopa, Gento. They won the European Cup 5 times in a row. Of course, the competition was still in its infancy, and that's something that won't happen again. Then I would say that was briefly followed by Santos, the Brazilian team with Pelé in the 60s. They played a fantastic game. And then I'd highlight the Barcelona team I mentioned, even in those years when they didn't always win the Champions League. They only won it 3 times in those years, but they still played the most beautiful soccer in that time. Of course, there were other eras too. There was Ajax Amsterdam in the 70s, followed by Bayern Munich, when they had Gerd Müller and Franz Beckenbauer. Ajax Amsterdam played amazing soccer with Johan Cruyff, of course. Then there was Liverpool for a while, and then Real Madrid again at the turn of the century, when they won the Champions League 3 times at 2-year intervals. Then, of course, you can't forget Real Madrid's achievements during Cristiano Ronaldo's time. They rarely won the Spanish League, only twice with Ronaldo, but they won the Champions League 4 times. So obviously, they were a really great team. I don't think you see teams of that quality here in Europe at the moment.
Not today. Okay, let's move on.
Interestingly, when the Intercontinental Cup was still being played between the winner of the Champions League in Europe and the winner of the Copa Libertadores in South America, a time when by no means all the best South American players were playing in Europe, it is remarkable that this Intercontinental Cup was won slightly more times by the South American team. 6 different teams from Argentina, for example, won it, but also tiny Uruguay had 2 champions. Peñarol Montevideo and Nacional Montevideo both won the Intercontinental Cup 3 times. So the standard of South American soccer is absolutely incredible.
Radim, a lot of information there, and I thank you for that, because as I say, I was chuckling when we were setting this up, because I find it quite revelatory, and I believe a lot of other people have nice memories of it, who perhaps follow soccer or see it the same way. But now I'd like to focus on you. If you had a chance to assemble an all-star team, A team, a B team, I don't care how many teams, who would you pick? What would you like? You have absolutely free reign.
I would start by pointing out that this is incredibly subjective because everyone would obviously choose a different team based on their own preferences. As I said, I mainly lean towards technical, attacking soccer. I love the extraordinary flair of those players. Of course, it's not entirely fair because there are infinite teams of 11 you can put together, but I'd certainly have a go at naming at least 1 or 2. If I were to put together a team of players that I think should be there would have to be 3 defenders, 2 midfielders and 5 forwards. But let's start with the goalkeeper. On balance, I'd name Iker Casillas from Spain. He won everything there was to win, and he played at the very top level for years. Then I think in defence I would name Brazil's Djalma Santos at right back, a double world champion and a fabulous right back in his day. Franz Beckenbauer as sweeper. In my opinion, he was probably the best libero of all time. On the left side of defence, I'd definitely pick Roberto Carlos, the Brazilian world champion and long-time Real Madrid mainstay, an outstanding player. My first midfielder would be José Andrade. A Uruguayan, he is perhaps the only pre-war player in my team. He was the best player in the world in his time. Interestingly, in 1950, when Uruguay won for the second time, another Andrade was in Uruguay's midfield. But it wasn't his son, it was his nephew. I think I'd name Didi from Brazil as my second midfielder. Didi was simply a fantastic player, a playmaker. Theoretically, he could be in attack, but I'd put him here as a playmaker and then the 5 forwards. And here it's pretty straightforward for me. Garrincha on the right, Messi next to him, Pelé in the middle, alongside him Maradona, and on the left the Brazilian Ronaldo. They're simply the 5 best players ever. Perhaps Alfredo Di Stefano belongs there too, but here I'm getting to the B team and I'd play a 3-3-4 to be a bit fairer in the midfielders and have a couple more of them. Looking at the defence, there's obviously a whole lot of goalkeepers, so that's a tough one. It's very subjective. I'd put England's Gordon Banks in goal. The full-backs, they're always Brazilians, so here it would be Cafu. As sweeper, I'd have Daniel Passarella from Argentina, also a world champion. On the left, I'd put Nilton Santos, the namesake of Djalma Santos, and also a double world champion and a great left back. As far as the midfield is concerned, I would probably pick 3 Europeans this time. One would be Bobby Charlton from England, who we've mentioned. Then there would be Zinedine Zidane, also a world champion, a World Cup finalist, a player who won it all, a legendary midfielder. It's hard to pick a third, probably Andreas Iniesta, one of my personal favourites. He was playmaker for Spain and Barcelona and scored the winner in the World Cup against Holland. I'm sure I could come up with plenty of other phenomenal players, but I can only pick 3. So that's my choice. And in attack, on the right wing, I would put another Brazilian. That would be Jairzinho, a fantastic right winger. Then there would be Johan Cruyff from Holland. He would definitely have to be there. Alfredo Di Stefano, the Argentine who orchestrated Real Madrid's success and who I would definitely rank among the 5 or 6 best soccer players ever. On the right wing, I would put one of the best Europeans in history, Cristiano Ronaldo.
I have to pat myself on the back because I knew quite a few of those names, so that's good. Let me ask you, Radim, you've already indicated that we've singled out the top players of the 20th and 21st centuries. That would be Pelé and Messi. Looking at the lists here, you have a lot of players. They were from the last century. Do you think they would be successful in modern-day soccer?
No question about it, yes, because I think the extraordinary talents these players had were nurtured at a time when soccer was played on poorer quality pitches with poorer quality balls. There wasn't so much information about the best nutrition, the best training methods, the best recuperation. So if those players were playing today, they would stand out just as much as they did then. There's no doubt in my mind.
You've given me a complete soccer refresher. This is the last question, because I've peeked at my watch and we've gone way beyond what we planned. And viewers, if you made it this far, I congratulate you for enjoying it as much as we have here. Radim, you have 6 boys, 6 sons. Is there a soccer star in the making among them? You knew I was going to ask you that question. It's important to me, and I think the whole conversation, is this something important to you as a soccer fan?
Of course, I'd love it if my boys enjoyed soccer. I wouldn't mind at all if they liked to play it. And if they do, I'd be happy if they had talent. But most important of all for me is that my sons love the Lord Jesus Christ and that they form a genuine relationship with the Lord. If that's complemented by the fact that they can also play soccer, all well and good. But the most important thing is not to miss out on eternal life. We can only gain that by surrendering our lives to the Lord Jesus Christ. I pray and believe that my boys will be clear in their minds about their top priority in life.
Radim, thank you for making time for us again. Thank you also to the guys behind the cameras here, from the Gordwood family and their friends around here for putting this together. If another interesting topic comes up, we'd like to borrow you again, if you don't mind.
Thank you, and God blessings to all.
Thank you.